In 2022, I sat my A-Levels, which included AQA Economics, and out of the 525 markers there were over the 3 papers, I managed to achieve 25 out of 25 in 3 out of the 5. I then got 24 out of 25 on one of the others and 19 out of 25 on the final one. So I think I have a decent idea of what needs to be done in order to achieve those top marks in these A-level economics essays. So the first aspect is just getting the knowledge. So first and foremost, you have to gain and acquire that economic knowledge, so when you're hit with an essay question, you have the foundation to build your answer upon. After all, you're not going to achieve the top marks in an economics essay if you don't have the foundation of knowledge to answer that essay question. So what I would recommend for this is A, focus on understanding. Namely, focus on understanding the arguments that are commonly used in economics essays and why they make sense. For instance, what privatization is and the theory behind it being effective. Or what an indirect tax is, the theory behind it, why the diagram for indirect tax looks the way it does, and what the effect of this is. Building up this basic economic knowledge is very important at the first level of answering these essay questions. And then B, once you've understood it, remember it. Usually, most things just stick once you truly understand it, so this memorization section is not as important as the understanding section, but inevitably, not everything will stick, and some things will fall out of your memory, and you'll just forget them. So for me, what I did is I used flashcards to help remember the economic knowledge. I personally used Brainscape, and to get more information, or to see the specific cards I used for studying economics A-level, just go down to the description of this video. So now we've got the first step out of the way, which is acquiring the economic knowledge and remembering the economic knowledge to use in your essays. Let's go on to the second phase, which is essay structure. Now, as I'm sure you know, there's not one shoe fits all in terms of essay structure for an economics A-level essay. 2 different top band or top mark essays can adopt very different structures and both still be equally successful. So I'm just going to go through the structure that I personally used for my economics essays. This isn't me saying you should too necessarily use the same structure, nor that this is the best structure available. This is just the one that I personally used. So starting off with the introduction. So the first thing I would clearly do in my introduction is just define the key terms. And this was mainly just to show the examiner that I have a good level of economic knowledge and economic understanding of these key terms. And then what I would do is I would outline the issues or the things I'm going to address in my essay. For instance, let's say the questions about the overconsumption of a demerit good. My introduction would usually define what a demerit good is and probably what a negative externality in consumption looks like. And I would then bring in the issues I'm going to address in my essay at tackling this overconsumption. For instance, I might talk about an indirect tax, information campaigns, and behavioural theories. I would then go on to my first paragraph, and this paragraph would introduce the first point I outlined in my introduction. So sticking with this overconsumption of a demerit good example, this would be about an indirect tax. Usually, especially for my first point, I would try and use a diagram just to bring in some economic analysis and knowledge to the question. So in this case, I might use a negative externalities in consumption diagram. I would then analyse the diagram completely. So sticking with this example, I would explain the divergence between the marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit. I would explain why the socially optimal level of consumption is where it is, and why the private level of consumption, the consumption we see in the free market, is where it is as well. I would then draw my indirect tax onto the diagram and show the effect and consequence of this. And ultimately, I would finish this paragraph showing how, in this case, an indirect tax would be effective at dealing with this issue of overconsumption. Then moving on, my next paragraph or paragraphs would just be evaluating this point as much as I possibly could. Evaluation is the thing that is really key in achieving the top marks in these essays. Constant, deep, and thorough evaluation is what helps you access these top marks. You can see here that the difference between a level 4 response and a level 5 response is the level of evaluation that is seen in the essay. For both level 4 and level 5, sound, focused analysis is required. However, you need to have well-supported evaluation to access that level 5, compared to just some supported evaluation for level 4. So I guess this begs the question of what does evaluation actually mean and what does it look like in practice? From Learn Economics, it defines evaluation as follows. To evaluate in economics means to consider the value of something, an explanation, theory, or policy, in terms of whether it achieves an objective or provides an effective explanation. So essentially, you're just trying to consider and look at all the things that could limit the effectiveness of a policy or argument. So, sticking with the same example, let's look at all the things that might limit the effectiveness of an indirect tax when dealing with this demerit good. We could consider the price elasticity of demand. If this is a demerit good, let's take some examples: chocolate, sweets, alcohol. It's likely to be highly addictive. And as you know, addictiveness is a determinant of inelastic demand. And inelastic demand means that when we apply the indirect tax, most of the tax is going to be borne on the consumer and not the producer. Another thing we can think about is the regressive nature of taxation, and we can couple this with the inelastic demand curve. An inelastic demand curve means the price is going to shoot up much more than the reduction in quantity. We can question whether a large increase in price is good for the consumer, and chances are it's not. Also, it may be difficult for the government or whoever's applying this tax to know the ideal and correct amount of tax to apply to get to the socially optimal level. And overtaxing or undertaxing would limit the effectiveness of this policy. I'm sure there's many more examples, but these are ones I can just think of off the top of my head. And basically this next paragraph is me just plummeting with evaluation and explaining why this policy, which in my first paragraph I explained why in theory it's good, may not actually be that good in reality. I will then try and repeat this again for maybe 1 or 2 more points, depending on how much time I have and how much detail I'm going into. One thing I do want to say is that don't be afraid to use a diagram within your evaluation. For instance, evaluating a policy of higher income tax with a Laffer curve is very much valid and very good. So after I've done this with maybe 2 or 3 points, 2 or 3 policies, and then lots of evaluation with those policies, I would then come to my conclusion. And what I would always try and do, and what I would recommend, is making sure my conclusion went hand in hand with my introduction. For example, if my introduction said I was going to address these 2 policies or these 3 policies, my conclusion would be something like, so after considering these 2 or 3 policies, this policy would be most effective, or this policy would be most effective, or a combination of both policies would be most effective. And then explaining to the examiner how I reached that conclusion by summarising the arguments in my main body. And in the conclusion, you're still adding evaluation to this essay, which, as we've already determined, is what's really important. Again, sticking with this example, the indirect tax would lead to an increase in price, which we've determined may not be the best for the consumer. However, when we compare it to another policy, such as information campaigns, which make people aware of the negatives of these demerit goods, which therefore might reduce demand for these goods, that would lead to a decrease in price, along with that decrease in quantity, which would be better for the consumer. So we can evaluate in our conclusions by comparing these policies. And that essentially is the essence of how I'm structuring these essays. As a quick note, if you have any questions about my essay structure or the style, do let me know down in the comments. But now we're going to move on to some more practical things. So yes, occasionally I would write essays, but I found doing lots and lots of plans more useful because the writing isn't that difficult if you know what you're going to say already. So in terms of essay plans, A, do lots of them, and B, do them with your friends. Now, I'm usually not the biggest fan of planning stuff with your friends because it can usually be more of a distraction than an aid. But in terms of essay plans, when I did it with my friends, it was actually really useful. It helps with a sense of accountability, and also it means that you can utilise ideas from different people. It also means that you can usually get more essay plans done per unit time, which is always good. Now in terms of choosing questions. Now definitely for AQA you get a choice of questions, and I think for other exam boards this is the case as well. My biggest tip here is just try not to be indecisive. Sometimes a particular essay question will just jump out at you and you know you want to do that, but other times you might be quite indifferent between the two. At the end of the day, if you are fully and properly prepared for your exam, which hopefully you will have done, then it doesn't matter too much which question you do, you should be doing well regardless. And finally, time management. So yes, I still think essay plans are more important than actually writing out the essay, but do get used to writing essays in 40 to 45 minutes just to make sure that you can do it. I personally found that the economics exam was tightest on time out of all my A-levels, but that might just be the nature of it being an essay subject rather than a more STEMmy subject. What I would say though is try and finish every essay, even if it's a bit shorter and you don't include all the points you necessarily want to. Rather than using your scarce time to do lots of points but not evaluating or concluding, try and do less points but with more evaluation and a conclusion, as that should get you higher marks. And that wraps this video up. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.